The military strategy of island hopping during World War II was significant to the United States in winning the war in the Pacific because it effectively moved the U.S. troops closer to Japan.
The surprise attacks on Pearl Harbor led to the entrance of World War II. The attack gave pride to the Americans across the country, and within 24 hours, recruiting offices had lines going for blocks to sign up for the war. Every man who could serve did serve.
December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
This is the story of what is happening to the American small town in wartime. The town is being invaded. The invaders are not enemies, but friends.
Having had the war spread in the Pacific, the U.S. is faced with the complications of preparing for the Japanese. During this period, women worked in factories throughout much of the West and East. They also became the head of the house and were responsible for rationing goods for the troops overseas.
Women went into the workforce to compensate for the loss of men during the war. They took tasks of working in all sorts of professions, even in the industrial factories building vehicles for the war, such as boats, cars, trucks, and planes. After the Battle of Midway, the U.S. needed a more effective strategy to get across the islands to reach Japan. Douglas MacArthur and Chester W. Nimitz came up with the island hopping strategy, which was to capture key islands, one after another, until Japan was in bombing distance for the U.S. bombers. It was first used by Nimitz in the Guadalcanal and some islands in Sullivan. When they reached the island, bombers would wipe out the whole island. Then, when the troops reached there, they would rush in and kill as many of the remaining enemy as they could before dying themselves.
The strategy of island hopping worked because it took the enemy by surprise with a fast attack with an overwhelming majority.
The U.S. troops would pull up in Higginsburg, and as the bottom of the boat got stuck in the sand, the door would drop down and all the men would rush out and attack their enemy.
祖国のため、我々は最後の一兵になろうと、この島で敵を食いとどめることが責務である。生きて、再び祖国の地を踏めることなき者と覚悟せよ。Any theories why they ain't shooting?
Maybe they're all dead. What do you think, Doc? You think they're all dead?
行きましょう。撃て！
Once on the island, they would capture Japanese military points. After, they would build a landing strip to be able to launch planes off of it for another attack on the next island. Then, the troops would establish a U.S. military point.
The United States only attacked the more important islands and bypassed the rest. Once they cut off the island, the enemies on them could do nothing, so they were no longer a threat.
5 months in every year.
Washing through mud, living in mud, lying in mud, and sleeping in mud, and drinking in mud, and eating in mud. That was the monsoon in Burma. It's just a nightmare.
Douglas MacArthur was an American general who played a prominent role in the Pacific Theater. MacArthur oversaw the occupation of Japan from 1945 to 1951. and is credited for making far-ranging democratic changes in the country. MacArthur was a brilliant commander and had a military dictum: in war, there is no substitute for victory. MacArthur was one of only 5 men ever to rise to the rank of General of the Army. As rapidly as ships, men, and material became available, Nimitz shifted to the offensive and defeated the Japanese Navy in the Battle of Coral Sea, the Battle of Midway, and in the Solomon Islands campaign. If all travel distance by both Japan and America were added up, the area covered would be the entire Pacific Ocean, which means they traveled 64 million square miles in the span of the Pacific theater. Thanks to the brilliant mind of Nimitz, island hopping drastically reduced the distance traveled by the U.S. Navy.
Fleet Admiral William Bull Halsey was a naval officer and commander of the U.S. Third Fleet during much of the Pacific War against Japan. He took command in the South Pacific area in mid-October of '42, at a critical stage of the Guadalcanal campaign. After completing his tour of duty in the Guadalcanal, the admiral then left the South Pacific in May of '44, as the war was surging towards the Philippines and Japan. From September of '44 to January of '45, he led the Third Fleet during campaigns to take the Palos, Leyte, and Luzon, and on many raids on Japanese bases. The Battle of Guadalcanal caused the U.S. to gain control of the Solomon Islands, which gave the U.S. another front to attack other islands. Thanks to bad weather, the Allied Expeditionary Force arrived in the vicinity of the Guadalcanal undetected by the Japanese on the morning of August 7th. The landing forces split into 2 groups, with one group assaulting Guadalcanal and the other attacking other islands nearby. Allied warships bombarded the invasion beaches while U.S. carrier aircraft bombed Japanese airstrips, destroying 15 Japanese seaplanes at their base near Tulagi.
The Guadalcanal campaign was costly to Japan both strategically and in material losses. Japan lost control of the Solomon Islands and the ability to interdict Allied ships to Australia. Most importantly, scarce Japanese land, air, and naval forces has disappeared forever into the Guadalcanal jungle and surrounding seas. The Japanese aircraft and ships destroyed and sunken in the campaign were irreplaceable, and were their highly trained and veteran crews. After Guadalcanal, the Japanese were clearly on the defense in the Pacific. The constant need to reinforce Guadalcanal had weakened Japanese efforts in their other theaters, contributing to the successful Australian counteroffensive in New Guinea, which culminated into the capture of the key bases of Buna and Gona in early 1943. The island Burma was attacked because the U.S. goal was to capture the town of Myitkyina, which was a principal Japanese communist post. Also, another goal for the island was to capture the Burma Road, which linked Burma and China and was blocked off by the Japanese. One marine company attacked across the sandbar at the mouth of the Matsukwa River, while another company crossed the river 1,000 yards inland and attacked the Japanese forces located in Matsukwa village. The 3rd Marine Company landed by boat further west and attacked Kolombuna village. After briefly occupying the 2 villages, the 3 Marine companies returned to the Laguna perimeter, having killed about 65 Japanese soldiers while losing only 4 of themselves. The British administration collapsed ahead of the advancing Japanese troops and were expelled from most of Burma, but the Allies counterattacked. By 1945, the Allies had retaken the country. The Burmese fought for both sides in the war. Although many Burmese fought initially for the Japanese, some Burmese also served in the British Burma Army. Later in the war, the Americans created the American Kachin Rangers, who also fought for the Allies. Island hopping didn't require a major amount of ground support, but it did use a little amount, because then it wouldn't have been effective, which saved many lives in the long run during the war. They wanted to fortify the islands to turn them into a giant defense chain. The islands were only lightly, if defended at all, so they were easy to seize and occupy. The Japanese thought that if they were heavily fortified, all of the islands was then an enemy, such as the United States would try to fight long before they had reconquered all the islands and gotten close to Japan. What they didn't realize was that it wasn't necessary to reconquer every island. The United States only attacked the more important ones and bypassed the rest. Once the island was invaded, the enemies on them could do no more, so they were no longer a threat.
Fighting in the south was hardest. The Japanese soldiers hid in caves armed with hidden machine guns and explosives. The U.S. forces often lost many men before clearing out the Japanese out from each cave or other hiding places. Iwo Jima was key because it was right next to Japan and can be used as an access point if needed. The United States captured Iwo Jima in February. The island was psychologically important because it was a traditional Japanese territory administered by the Tokyo Prefecture. It was heavily defended with many underground entrenchments, but was eventually taken by Marines after they captured Mount Shirobaki, a keystone of the defense. Iwo Jima proved invaluable because of its two airfields that were used for emergency landings for B-29s, and because it was close enough to provide fighter escort that could reach the Japanese home islands. The island was also used as an air-sea rescue base after its seizure. However, the traditional justification for Iwo Jima's strategic importance to the United States war effort has been that it provided a landing and refueling site for American bombers on missions to and from Japan. The Japanese on Iwo Jima had radar with which they notified their comrades at home of incoming B-29s flying from the marinas. The U.S. took Iwo Jima to stop them from doing this.
After falling for 43 seconds, the time and barometric triggers started the firing mechanism. A uranium bullet fired down a barrel into a uranium target. Together, they started a nuclear chain reaction. Solid matter began to come apart, releasing untold quantities of energy.
Two islands, Iwo Jima and Okinawa, were both the last Japanese strongholds. Without these two islands, planes would have to travel 2,700 miles without fighter protection. Iwo Jima lies 660 miles south of Tokyo and was fortified with around 21,000 Japanese troops. This depth allowed troops to be safe from bombings above. Artillery was strategically placed on Mount Suribachi, the island's highest point. Okinawa lies only 375 miles from the Japanese camp.
I dreamed I was missing. You were so scared.